Imagine holding in your hand a quirky little creature with fuzzy fur, pointy ears, and an oddly mischievous grin. That's Labubu, a collectible elf-like monster who looks at once adorable and a bit sinister, and yet completely captivating. But Labubu didn't appear out of thin air. Its existence is the culmination of decades of toy design evolution, from playful plushes to tiny collectibles, art toys, and strategic surprises. Let's rewind and trace this lineage, exploring how each stage laid the groundwork for the rise of Labubu. We start in the 1980s with plush monsters who dared to be different. Think of My Pet Monster, blue and fuzzy with horns, fangs, even plastic shackles. It wasn't just a toy, it felt like rebellion wrapped in fluff, edgy yet endearing. That contrast between cute and creepy, soft and wild, My Pet Monster pioneered the vibe Labubu would later perfect. While in Europe and America, micropets roamed on the shelves, over in Japan, something smaller but no less impactful was brewing: keshi, tiny rubber figurines often packaged as surprise freebies. These little eraser-style toys featured characters from universes like Ultraman or kaiju monsters, and collectors chased them across cereal boxes, candy packs, blind grab bags, anything that held one of the miniature creatures. Their magic wasn't in grandeur, it was in scale, collection, and mystery. The idea that a tiny, mysterious figure could ignite curiosity and collectability planted an early seed for what would one day become known as the blind box craze. By the 1990s and early 2000s, a radical shift occurred as toys began to wear the mantle of art. The region of Hong Kong and Japan fueled the birth of the designer toy or art toy movement. Michael Lau, a Hong Kong artist, transformed the familiar into the extraordinary through his urban vinyl art, modifying G.I. Joe dolls into streetwear-clad characters that whispered stories of subculture, rebellion, and identity. He didn't just create toys, he brought self-expression to plastic and vinyl. Across the globe, Kidrobot in the United States launched vinyl platforms like the Dunny and Money, inviting artists to reimagine blank figures in their own styles. And Medicum's Bear Brick became a canvas for fashion, pop culture, and collaboration, bringing together artists, luxury brands, and collectibles under one bear-shaped roof. Collectors weren't just buying toys anymore, they were acquiring art pieces, culture icons, and personal statements. These art toys blurred the boundaries between adulthood and commerce. They taught us that toys could make statements, could be scarce, could be collectible. Enter Mart, the artist-led Chinese company founded in 2010 who turned the designer toy into a blind box spectacle, propelling collectibles into trendy territory. By selling surprise figures sealed in boxes, marketed like high-end fashion drops, Mart elevated toy buying into a performative ritual. By 2015, a character named Labubu had been sketched in Longevity by Hong Kong illustrator Casing Long, inspired by Nordic folklore and nestled into his picture book universe known as The Monsters. But it wasn't until 2019, when Mart picked up Labubu, that she stepped onto the global stage, sealing herself in blind boxes, building anticipation, fostering fandom. Labubu's design encapsulates the lineage of its ancestors. She carries the rebellious charm of My Pet Monster, soft yet sharp, innocent yet wild. She fits into the collectible mystique of keshi toys, appearing in random boxes that promise discovery. And she embodies the artistry and emotional toys, complete with personality, narrative, and visual allure. She is both toy and art, comfort and thrill. This combination couldn't have come at a better time. Across the world, the kid-alt market, adults who buy toys for themselves, has surged. In 2024, adult consumers eclipsed children in toy spending in many markets. And by 2025, toy sales in the US grew significantly in value and volume, led by adults aged 18 and up. Collectibles, nostalgia, and creative play drove this resurgence. People sought comfort, expression, and fun, and Labubu captured all three. Labubu's popularity became unstoppable after a celebrity moment. Blackpink's Lisa was spotted with a Labubu charm dangling from her designer bag, igniting a wildfire of demand across Asia and beyond. Suddenly, Labubu wasn't just a toy. She was fashion, she was identity, she was viral. In 2025, Mart reaped immense rewards. Blind box sales boomed, plush toy revenue surged over 1,200%, and Mart's total revenue more than doubled to over 13 billion yuan. CEO Wang Ning's net worth skyrocketed, making him one of China's youngest top billionaires. Collectors embraced Labubu not just as playthings but as status symbols. At a Beijing auction, a 4-foot marine Labubu sold for over $170,000, setting records and underscoring the doll's symbolic and market value. Meanwhile, the trend raised real-world concerns. Counterfeit dolls known as Lafufus flooded markets, illicit imitations sometimes made of unsafe materials or wiring, prompting trading standards in Scotland to confiscate hundreds of fake dolls and warn consumers. Collectible culture also sparked psychological debates. Many saw how blind boxes and scarcity-driven models could foster compulsive buying, especially when marketing hinges on surprise, limited editions, and FOMO. Despite controversies, Labubu's aesthetic continues to resonate with the human need for comfort, play, and identity. She recalls Beanie Babies, Webkins, and other childhood icons while ushering in new rules: adult fandom, fashion convergence, digital shareability. Seen another way, Labubu's success is a masterclass in emotional design. Her appearance blends baby schema features, big eyes, chubby shape, with asymmetry or edge. That ugly cute mix triggers comfort and curiosity. Her consistent design allows her to morph into plush toys, keychains, giant figures, art pieces, always recognizable. She was never just a random monster. Labubu carries a story, part elf, part trickster, part fashion statement. Her iterations, like Macaron series, museum exclusives, One Piece crossovers, or Coca-Cola editions, each added narrative layers, new fandom corners, surprise, and collectability. Her journey from a Nordic-inspired drawing to collectible icon spans eras of toy culture: the rebellious plush, the miniature mystery, designer art toys, and immersive narrative-driven collectibles. She's the sum of them all, animated into one fanged, furry package. Understanding the ancestors of Labubu reveals how toys evolve along with culture. Labubu didn't just rise, she inherited pulses going back decades. She reflects how we now crave toys that evoke emotion, art, surprise, and identity, no matter our age. As the toy world moves forward, the next wave will likely draw from this same blueprint: design that surprises, narrative that binds, and icons that blur lines between childhood, art, and adulthood. Labubu is both child and collector, plush and art, comfort and frenzy. A toy that ancient storytellers might have envied, now nestled in our hands, reminding us that play doesn't end with age, it evolves.
The rain had been falling all day, turning the small town streets into winding rivers of mud. Harold, the town's only antique dealer, had grown used to wandering into forgotten places whenever the weather pushed everyone else indoors. He had a taste for the unusual: rusted clocks, cracked mirrors, furniture that smelled of dust and age. But what drew him most were the houses nobody touched, the ones that seemed to carry whispers in their peeling wallpaper and hollow rooms. That afternoon, he found himself standing before the largest of them all, a 3-story Victorian mansion on the far edge of town. People said no one had lived there for decades. The roof sagged in the middle, ivy clung to the broken shutters, and a single upstairs window gaped open as though the house were breathing out its last ghostly sighs. Harold pushed the door open. It groaned against the wind like it hadn't been moved in years. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and wood rot. Rain tapped against the broken glass panes, dripping in slow, rhythmic beats somewhere deeper in the house. He walked through what had once been the grand parlor. A fireplace gaped black and cold on the far wall. Dust-covered furniture lay scattered like corpses after a long-forgotten party. His flashlight beam swept across cracked portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. But it was upstairs, in the smallest of the rooms, that Harold found it. The door was locked at first. He had to push hard with his shoulder before it creaked open. The room smelled strange. Less of dust, more of something sweet and metallic, like old perfume and dried flowers. In the corner, on a cracked wooden windowsill, sat a single doll. It was small, about the size of a child's forearm. Its head was slightly too big for its body, its wide eyes painted black and shining strangely in the beam of Harold's flashlight. Its grin was the thing that made him pause, a thin, curling smile, the kind that seemed frozen halfway between joy and mockery. The paint on its cheeks was faded, but the face itself had not cracked like so many old dolls he had seen before. It looked preserved, almost new. Harold picked it up. The porcelain felt cool against his skin, despite the warmth of his gloves. Its little arms were jointed, able to move up and down. A tiny bell was sewn into its faded fabric clothing, though it made no sound when he shook it. There was no box, no tag, nothing to explain what it was doing there, sitting all alone in a house no one had entered in decades. "Someone will pay good money for you," Harold muttered, wrapping the doll carefully in his coat. Behind him, the wind rattled the broken window, and for a moment, Harold thought he heard something else, like the faintest sound of giggling. But when he turned, the room was empty.
Harold returned to his shop late in the evening, the rain still clinging to the streets in silver sheets. He locked the door behind him, the chime above the frame giving a single hollow note before silence settled over the small, cluttered space. His shop was his whole world, rows upon rows of shelves stuffed with everything from old clocks to oil lamps, leather-bound books, and chipped porcelain teacups. Each object carried a story, though most were silent about it. Harold liked it that way. The stillness comforted him. He set the doll on the counter beside the register, unwrapping it carefully from his coat. Its painted grin glimmered faintly in the dim yellow light. It looked oddly alive in this space, far newer than the other relics that surrounded it. "Tomorrow," Harold murmured to himself, "I'll clean you up, find out what you're worth." He leaned closer, studying its face. The eyes were particularly strange, black yet shiny, as though they were wet. They caught the light in a way that made it seem like the doll was watching him. The grin was too wide, too deliberate, as if the artist who made it had given it a secret. Shaking off the feeling, Harold turned off the lights and went upstairs to his small apartment above the shop. The floorboards creaked as he crossed the living room. Rain hissed softly against the windows. He made himself tea, read for a while, then finally went to bed. It was after midnight when the first sound came. Tap. Harold stirred, half asleep. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, like something hard knocking against wood, irregular and unhurried. He sat up, listening. The shop below was always silent at night. No one came in after closing. The street outside was empty, especially in weather like this. Another sound came, soft but clearer this time, like tiny footsteps crossing a wooden floor. Harold grabbed his flashlight and went downstairs. The air felt colder as he opened the door to the shop, the beam of light cutting through the shadows between the shelves. Nothing moved. But when the beam fell on the counter, Harold paused. The doll was no longer where he'd left it. It was sitting at the edge of the counter now, legs dangling, as though it had been waiting there all night. Its head was tilted slightly toward the door, its black eyes staring at the rain-streaked window as though watching for someone. Harold frowned, confused. Had he left it like that? Maybe he had put it there earlier without realizing. He picked the doll up and set it back in the center of the counter, this time facing away from the door. "Stay put," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head at himself. As he turned to leave, he didn't notice the faintest sound that followed, the smallest creak, like wood bending under weight. The doll's head, ever so slightly, shifted back toward the door again.
The next morning, Harold arrived downstairs to open the shop. Rain had stopped in the night, leaving the streets outside washed and empty under a pale gray sky. He flipped the sign on the door to open and turned on the shop lights, yawning as the familiar glow revealed shelves lined with antiques from a dozen forgotten eras. As he walked toward the counter, his steps slowed. The doll was facing the door again. He stopped a few feet away staring at it. He could have sworn he'd left it turned away the night before. Maybe he was misremembering. Maybe. But for a brief moment, the room felt colder than it should have been, and he caught himself glancing at the corners, half expecting to see something watching from the shadows. The bell above the door rang. A middle-aged woman in a bright yellow raincoat stepped inside, shaking water from her umbrella. She smiled at Harold, then her eyes fell on the doll. "Oh," she said, stepping closer, "that's quite a thing you've got there. Where did you find it?" "Old house on the edge of town," Harold said, clearing his throat. "Thought someone might want it for a collection. Dolls like this can be rare." The woman leaned over the counter, peering into the doll's face. "It looks so strange, almost alive," she chuckled softly. "Creepy, but in a fun way." She didn't buy anything, but before she left, she turned back once more to look at the doll. Its head was tilted slightly toward her, its black eyes fixed in her direction. 2 days later, Harold read in the local paper that a woman had gone missing. At first, he didn't think about the connection. People disappeared sometimes. Arguments at home, bad weather, maybe she just left town. That was what he told himself. But then a man came in a few days later, drawn by the same thing. "That doll," he said, pointing at it. "It's been in the window all week, hasn't it? Something about it, I don't know, gives me the shivers." He laughed, but his laugh was hollow. He stared at the doll for a long time, as though waiting for it to blink. Harold told him the same thing, that it was just a piece for sale, nothing more. The man disappeared the following night. Now Harold couldn't ignore it. He sat behind the counter that evening, long after closing, the shop silent except for the faint tick of a clock in the corner. The doll sat on the counter in front of him, grinning as always. Harold felt it stare like a weight on his chest. He thought about moving it to the back room, maybe locking it away. But then he saw it, just a flicker, a shadow in the reflection of the glass case behind the counter. Something moved between the shelves, quick and low to the ground. When he spun around, the shop was empty. By the fourth night, Harold was no longer sleeping well. The shop had taken on a different feeling since the disappearances. What was once his sanctuary, a place of silent old things and gentle routine, now seemed to hum with something he couldn't name. The air was heavy at night, carrying the faintest sounds that didn't belong there. The creak of a floorboard when no one was walking, the metallic click of something shifting on a shelf. And always, the doll was at the center of it. Harold hadn't sold it, though part of him wondered why. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he wanted to prove something to himself. Or maybe, in some dark corner of his mind, he already knew no one would take it from him. He decided to check the security cameras. The shop had 3 of them, one above the front counter, one near the entrance, and one at the back of the room. They were old, the kind that recorded grainy black and white footage onto a computer Harold barely knew how to use. Still, the cameras had always done their job. He sat down in front of the monitor in the upstairs apartment and scrolled back through the nights since he'd brought the doll into the shop. The first hour of footage was uneventful. The shop sat empty, shadows stretching as cars passed occasionally outside. The doll sat on the counter, perfectly still. Then the clock on the footage ticked past midnight. Harold leaned closer. The doll's head moved. It was small at first, just a shift, as if the painted face was following something across the room. Then, slowly, it slid across the counter, its limbs jerking in unnatural, puppet-like motions. Harold froze. The doll stopped moving whenever headlights from outside passed the windows. sitting perfectly still until the light faded again. Then it would crawl a few inches more, its tiny porcelain hands tapping against the wood. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the doll slid down from the counter altogether. It moved off camera. Harold quickly switched to the feed from the back of the shop. The doll crawled into view on all fours, its head twitching as though sniffing the air. Its grin never changed. Then it stopped suddenly, turning its head directly toward the camera. It stayed like that for nearly a full minute, its black eyes glinting, its face frozen in that thin, knowing smile. The angle was bad, grainy and dark, but Harold swore it was looking right at him through the screen. Then the feed went black for 15 seconds. When it returned, the doll was back on the counter, facing the door again. Harold sat there for a long time after the footage ended, the hum of the monitor filling the room. His mouth was dry. His heart thumped in slow, heavy beats. Downstairs, the shop was dark and still. And yet, as he stared at the blank screen, he could have sworn he heard faint, muffled giggling drifting up from the floor below. The storm rolled in late the next evening. By the time Harold reached the shop, the streets were empty, slick with rain under the dim orange glow of street lamps. The wind rattled loose shutters and sent paper scraps spinning across the road. It was the kind of night when no one came out unless they had to. He almost didn't open the shop at all. The security footage from the night before sat heavy in his mind, like a weight pressing behind his eyes. He kept thinking about the doll staring into the camera, about the way it seemed to know it was being watched. But Harold was stubborn. He told himself it was just an object, a thing, porcelain and cloth and nothing else. He would stay late, sell a few things if anyone came by, then lock the place up for a few days and get some rest. The bell above the door rang. A man stepped inside, shaking water from his coat. He was tall, with tired eyes and a week's worth of stubble. He looked around slowly, his gaze passing over the shelves before settling on the counter, and on the doll. "That for sale?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Harold hesitated. He wanted to say yes, to hand it over, to let someone else take it far away from here. But before he could speak, the man stepped closer, peering into the doll's face. "Ugly little thing," he muttered. "Looks wrong." The doll sat perfectly still, its wide grin frozen as always. Yet the man kept staring at it like he expected it to move. Harold opened his mouth to explain the price, but the words stuck in his throat. The lights flickered. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the windows. And then, softly, from somewhere deep in the shop, came the sound. A faint giggle. The man turned sharply. "Did you hear that?" Harold's skin crawled. He knew the sound well by now. Too well. Another giggle followed, closer this time, weaving through the shelves like something playing hide and seek. The man frowned, glancing toward the back of the shop. "You got kids in here or something?" Before Harold could answer, the lights went out. The shop fell into darkness, the only illumination coming from flashes of lightning through the front windows. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, a shelf crashed somewhere in the back. The man swore under his breath, pulling a small flashlight from his coat pocket. Its beam cut across the aisles, empty shelves, broken glass on the floor, shadows shifting in corners. Another flash of lightning lit the shop. Every shelf was lined with dolls. Not just the one from the mansion, dozens of them, all identical, their faces turned toward the man and Harold, grinning in the sudden white light. The beam of the flashlight shook in the man's hand. What is this?" he whispered. Somewhere behind the shelves, something moved fast. The giggling grew louder. The man's flashlight swung wildly as the sound of tiny footsteps skittered across the floor. He backed toward the door, bumping into Harold, who stood frozen, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "Open the door," the man snapped, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" But Harold didn't move, because he could see them. The dolls. They weren't on the shelves anymore. They were on the floor. Dozens of them, identical to the first one from the mansion, all crouched low, heads tilted, black eyes reflecting the weak beam of the flashlight. Their grins never wavered as they crept closer in the strobing light of the storm outside. One by one, they began to giggle. The sound rose like wind through dead trees, a dozen voices all high and sweet and wrong, echoing through the small shop until it filled the air like smoke. The man lunged for the door handle, twisting hard, but it wouldn't budge. The lock refused to turn. Lightning split the sky. For a brief, blinding instant, Harold saw the dolls standing upright now, their heads tilted back, mouths open in wide, painted smiles. And then the lights went out completely. The man screamed. Something small and fast hit the floor beside him, then another, then a dozen more. The giggling became shrill, chaotic, almost deafening in the pitch-black room. Harold stumbled backward, hands groping for the staircase to his apartment, but the steps never came. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe. He heard the man shouting, swearing, kicking at something that wouldn't let go. Then, suddenly, silence. Not a sound. The storm still raged outside, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling through the cracks. But inside the shop, it was as if everything had been swallowed whole. When the lights flickered back on minutes later, the shop was empty. The man was gone. Harold was gone. Every shelf was bare. Only one doll sat on the counter, small hands folded neatly in its lap, its painted grin wide and bright under the buzzing light. The bell above the door jingled softly as the wind pushed it open. Rain blew in across the floorboards. The doll turned its head toward the sound and smiled. London, winter of the early 19th century, was a place of both progress and shadows. The city throbbed with the sounds of industry and trade by day, but when night fell, the fog rolled in off the Thames, curling like cold breath along the cobblestones. In the outlying village of Hammersmith, the darkness was thicker, the gas lamps fewer, and the wind that swept through its narrow lanes seemed to carry whispers. It began quietly at first, stories told in taverns of a figure dressed in white wandering near the churchyard at night. Some claimed it was a spirit of a man who had died and been buried without the rites of the church, his soul restless. Others spoke of a suicide, condemned to roam for eternity. Still others, more cynical, dismissed it all as drunken fancy. Yet those who swore they had seen the figure spoke with eyes wide, voices trembling. The sightings grew more frequent as the winter deepened. The figure appeared pale under the moonlight, its movements slow, deliberate, almost mournful. It vanished when approached, melting into hedgerows or into the swirling mist, as if the night itself swallowed it whole. Then came the first death, a pregnant woman who had encountered the apparition near the church wall. Neighbors said she returned home shaking violently, her face drained of color, unable to speak. Within days, she and her unborn child were gone. After that, fear rooted itself deep in Hammersmith's heart. A wagoner claimed the ghost leapt onto his horses one night, clamping icy hands around his throat until he nearly lost consciousness. He was found the next morning trembling beside his overturned cart, the animal skittish and foaming. The townspeople began locking their doors early. Few ventured out after dark unless forced, and even then they walked in groups, carrying lanterns and sticks, eyes darting at every flicker of shadow. The churchyard itself, once a place of quiet reflection, became a spot no one wished to cross after sunset. Francis Smith was among those who had grown tired of the stories. A tax collector by trade, practical by nature, he believed the so-called ghost was nothing more than a troublemaker, someone dressing up to frighten the simple-minded. The panic, the deaths, the whispers in the taverns, he found it intolerable. On the evening of January 3rd, 1804, the air was bitingly cold, the kind that crept through coats and gloves to gnaw at the bones. A pale moon hung low, casting silver light over the frozen fields. Smith armed himself with a shotgun, muttering to neighbors that he would put an end to this nonsense once and for all. If it was a man behind the haunting, he would answer for it. If it was something else, well, Smith didn't believe in such things. He set out after 9, boots crunching over frost-hardened earth. The village lay still, windows shuttered, only the occasional bark of a distant dog breaking the silence. He walked past the tavern, where a few men watched from the doorway, reluctant to follow, but eager to see what might happen. Smith's figure disappeared into the night toward the churchyard, the lantern light bobbing in his hand, the gun slung ready across his arm. Not long after, witnesses later said, there came the faint echo of a shout, Smith's voice, then the crack of a shot that rolled like thunder through the winter air. When they reached him, Francis Smith stood trembling, smoke rising from the barrel of his gun. At his feet lay a man in white, motionless, blood spreading darkly across the snow. It was not a ghost. It was Thomas Millwood, a local bricklayer. His work clothes, white shirt, linen trousers, and apron, had caught the moonlight just as they had on many nights before. Several neighbors would later admit they had warned Millwood to wear something darker, as his pale garb startled people even in daylight. But Millwood had laughed it off, saying a man should wear what he pleased. That night, his choice had cost him his life. Smith was horrified. He swore the figure had turned toward him suddenly, that he had shouted a warning and received no answer. Certain he was facing the infamous ghost, he had pulled the trigger. The killing shocked the village, but it did not end the strange tales. For weeks after Millwood's burial, people claimed to hear footsteps near the church at night when no one was there. Lanterns guttered suddenly in the wind, though the air was still. One man walking home swore he saw a pale shape standing at Millwood's grave, unmoving, watching him until he fled. Some whispered that the real ghost, the one blamed for all the panic, had never been caught, that it still wandered. Others said Millwood himself now walked the lanes where he had fallen, seeking justice, or perhaps revenge. The churchyard grew wilder that year, weeds curling over leaning stones, as if even nature hesitated to linger too long. At Smith's trial, the court wrestled with the strange circumstances. He had believed in good faith he was shooting a ghost. The law, however, could not excuse the death of an innocent man. He was found guilty of murder, though later pardoned, an uneasy compromise between justice and the bizarre truth. Yet the unease in Hammersmith lingered. Decades later, long after the original witnesses had passed on, people still claimed the churchyard carried a heaviness after dark. A constable walking his rounds in the 1830s reported hearing soft footsteps behind him on a foggy night. When he turned, no one was there. And in the late 19th century, a letter to a London newspaper described a traveler passing through Hammersmith who saw, by the light of a waning moon, a pale figure gliding between the graves before dissolving into mist. The traveler, unaware of the old story, had asked at the inn if the churchyard was known to be haunted. The innkeeper only nodded gravely. Even today, the Hammersmith ghost remains one of England's strangest tales, where fear and fact tangled so tightly that no one could quite separate them. A man had died, another had killed in terror, and beneath it all lingered the question no one could answer. Was there ever truly a ghost in Hammersmith, or did belief itself conjure something far darker on those winter nights?